Tell me what you like about Tyler Warren, who is generally seen as the consensus top tight end in this year's class.
Oh man, I think there's just a lot. There's a lot to like in terms of the athleticism, the size, like the movement ability. I thought it was interesting. Like if you go back kind of through his career, he basically broke out this year and had some flashes last year, but this was the big year. And it's just kind of interesting when you see a guy that big, that athletic, not really get going until his final year in college. But I don't really know how much, if I'm going to hold that against him at all. This is a special dude, man. You know a guy is kind of built different when the team is giving him like wildcat snaps at quarterback and he's averaging, a good, decent amount yards per carry, scoring touchdowns. So I think that even just shows the athleticism that he possesses at, 6'6", 260 pounds, 255 pounds, which is, I think that's something you can immediately bank on in the NFL. Like that kind of being maybe like a mismatch nightmare for linebackers and safeties if you're going to dial in and get him some, get us some design touches where you can get the ball and run out in space. I don't think he's the greatest inline guy, but in terms of blocking, but like you can say that about so many guys that we're going to talk about today. That like I almost wonder if we're just kind of moving towards like skill sets first, like what can you do with the ball in your hands? How do you look running routes and catching over some of the blocking stuff? Because, you would think for a guy that big and for someone I've seen him be compared to Rob Gronkowski, that's crazy. You would like Rob Gronkowski's one. He was like a 6 offensive tackle with the receiving stuff. So that's not quite Tyler Warren, but explosive receiving option. I think more than worthy of a first round pick.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely a first rounder. I want to talk about the production here as we're showing on the screen right now. 104 catches, over 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns. I mean, absurd from a production angle. He was 7th in the FBS in receiving yards last year. So he was up there with some of the most productive receivers from this year's draft class. Like he had more receiving yards than Kyle Williams, than Jalen Noel, than Jaden Higgins. A lot of guys who are going to get drafted high at the receiver position this year. He was just straight up more productive. But if you look at him, and also by the way, he scored 4 rushing touchdowns as well, as Charles mentioned. Like they would line him up all over the place. But if you look at like his career, it's pretty crazy that in 2021 he had 6 for 62. In 2022, he had 10 for 123, 3 touchdowns. The year before, in 2023, it had 422 yards and then 7 touchdowns. But this really was an explosion production season from him in his final collegiate season. I would say that for people who are concerned about that, and I have seen some people note that is a concern, there were some good tight ends on this Penn State roster, guys who are starting in the NFL right now. Theo Johnson was a good prospect in last year's class. He was kind of ahead of him. Even like Brenton Strange, who's currently, I guess the Jaguars starting tight end.
He was a second round pick.
Yeah, he was a second round pick, and he did. He definitely banged me in fantasy last year, but he had that one good week the week before I started him in fantasy. So what can you do? He's clearly capable of producing, not when it matters for me. But that's part of like the explanation. Maybe it's an excuse, but I think it's more of an explanation for why Tyler Warren wasn't productive. But I want to talk about like the nature of his production this year, Charles, because when I went back to watch him, I kind of had this, image in my mind of him and what I'd heard from other people as, like you said, this traditional tight end, like 6'5", over 260, tough guy from Penn State. I thought he was much more of like a designed touches sort of guy at tight end, which is really an anomaly. Does that concern you at all when projecting him to the next level?
Not really, because like there's definitely a fair amount of schemed up stuff, but I think when you watch him and the way he moves, like in and out of his cuts, and like sometimes you can just get like break down slot receiver or slot cornerbacks and linebackers and get open. I'm not really too concerned about it. I tend to view it as a plus because you have this guy who is this big and athletic, and you want to get him the ball in so many different ways. Like I obviously I know the rushing stuff is not going to be a big part of his NFL repertoire, but this year he carried the ball 26 times, 218 yards. That's 8.4 yards per carry. And like you said earlier, he scored 4 touchdowns. So there's really only so many guys at that size that can do stuff like that. And I do think it translates to the route running that you see from him, even if it's on some design stuff. And I think when you look at how Penn State's offense was set up, you have a quarterback who's a little shaky, your receivers aren't all that good, or maybe not as good as in years past, but you have this. So why not scheme a bunch of touches to him?
Yeah, so you seem like you're pretty high on what he can be as a route runner, even if it's a little bit of a projection just based on the movement skills here. I think I can see that as well. I think his landing spot's going to be pretty important in terms of like what we're talking about from a production ceiling, because I don't know, you tell me if you think this is wrong, but I thought he kind of, or at least I think he could be used in a way like the Lions use Sam Laporta, who's another guy that kind of gets a reputation as like he's a good blocker because he comes from Iowa, and I think that's like the only reason. But for the most part, like he's more of a mismatch receiving weapon. That's just my opinion about Laporta's blocking. I know Andy Behrens, if he's watching this right now, which is unlikely, but if he is, he's like pulling his hair out over me saying that. But like I see spots for Tyler Warren where, hey, what about 7? With the Jets, Tanner Engstrand coming from that team, the Detroit Lions, like could they use a mismatch weapon? They definitely need, I mean, we talked about with Danny Heifetz on the last episode, they definitely need a pass catching option. The Bears at 10, I think that's actually kind of ideal because they have an inline guy in Cole Kmet. That could just be another receiving weapon for Caleb Williams there. Those are 2 spots, at least to me, Charles, where I think you could design him some stuff that like we can clear space out with some receivers here, better receivers than the Raiders had last year at times with Brock Bowers. We can clear some space out and then let him do some damage underneath as a run after catch option. He's a real weapon.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The way I kind of look at where Tyler Warren is, and I really do like the Sam Laporta comp because I as good as Sam Laporta is, I do think that he was a big beneficiary of the scheme in Detroit. Like, some of these offenses, they just figure out how to get guys butt naked open on a crosser route or an over route. And that's where Sam Laporta lived. But like, if you can figure out how to scheme that open consistently, then all of a sudden you have, this giant guy who's fast as hell and good with the ball in his hands, screaming down a secondary, which is what I thought, that works for the Laporta comp. It works well for a potential Chicago fit with Ben Johnson. And I think that it's kind of all over Tyler Warren's tape at Penn State. Like there's a lot of quick hitters like up the seam where they're doing like little out routes where they can just get the ball in his hands and let him run downfield. I don't, like I said before, I don't really view that as a negative necessarily because he's just so big and athletic. Even if he's not going to be maybe, the most physically overwhelming, like dominant singular force like Rob Gronkowski was, or some of that nature, there's still so much value here as a receiver. And if I can scheme some touches and we got, this 6'6" guy who can really handle the ball against much smaller players, I think that's going to be a win. But I will say, I think he's probably close to a finisher piece on a offense that has some guys more than maybe where you start out with.
Right, which is why I thought like the Rams trading up for him would be pretty interesting. I mentioned that on the last episode as well. And just one other team. What about this team doesn't need him, but just in terms of like using him in the way that I think is best, like a lot of what the Dolphins did with Jonnu Smith last year, where they clear so much space with the receivers, and it's just like, well, there's Jonnu Smith, and that guy can rumble after the catch. And that's where I really think Tyler Warren would be kind of I love the way you said it, the finishing piece. And just last thing on the Sam Laporta stuff, and then we can move on to the next tight end here. This is one of the reasons I think it's tough with tight ends, man, is like, and again, Charles, I want your opinion on this. Like, to me, most NFL passing games aren't built to like flow through a tight end, and this is part of the reason why, one of the many reasons why I don't chart the position along with wide receivers is because they're just very different. Like conceptually, most of the first 3 plays are going to go to your perimeter receivers. Like with tight ends, it's so difficult from not only a deployment perspective, like are they an inline guy or are they like a big slot? And if they're a big slot, are you Dalton Kincaid where you're not even better than the team's slot receiver who they took in the damn 5th round in Khalil Shakir? But also just again, this is why Sam Laporta takes that big step back in the second season because Jameson Williams emerged and became like you were just picking up more yards throwing to Jameson Williams there. So this is just like my worry with the position all the time is like you can get jumped if you have a more dangerous wide receiver here. And that's why with Tyler Warren, some of these spots where they don't have that second receiver, like the Jets, I think that really stands out to me. But am I even directionally accurate with anything I'm saying there, Charles?
Yeah, you said a lot there, but I do think here
this is where I'm at with like unspooling the brain at this point.
Yeah, I do think you're in the right direction. Like, there, to me, one of the big things that is always kind of tough for me to parse with tight ends sometimes, like when I'm watching the film, is like, you look at Tyler Warren or really, really a lot of these guys where you talk about like the big slot role and they can play that in college where, you'll get Tyler Warren or Loveland or, Arroyo, the Miami tight end we'll talk about later. If they're matched up like a slot receiver, that's an athletic win like almost every single time. But in the NFL, it's just not that easy. So sometimes like you can get stuck, like you can get enamored with the receiving potential, but if you really can't play in line, then you kind of got to be like a Brock Bowers type. But I don't think it's so bad for Tyler Warren in that respect. So I still think like he's going to be a guy that gets a fair amount of targets year one. It's just going to be, you have to improve some of the inline stuff because I just don't know. There just aren't many guys that size who can just live in the slot in the NFL. It's just too hard. The guys are too quick. They're too fast. The defenses are too sophisticated.
Yeah, I am definitely sorry for taking us on a little bit of a weird tangent there, but watching Tyler Warren caused me to have a lot of these like meta thoughts about the tight end position, which is always just such a strange one in the NFL.